By spring you'll birth our sons, a mountain man told the obese teen he just bought. The crowd laughed in the freezing street, calling her worthless, mocking every step she took. But when the scarred stranger laid down his silver dollar, the jeers turned to silence. He didn't buy her for shame. He bought her to save her. In a lonely cabin high in the mountains, firelight flickers as she wonders if this man is her jailer or her only hope of dignity. Yet danger rides fast. A drunken father bent on revenge. Railroad man who will steal the valley and whispers that she's too broken to ever be a wife. But she carries something no one expected: strength. A voice that can hush a church and a heart the frontier will not crush. As storms close in and enemies circle, one question burns like a branding iron in the snow. Can two broken souls build a family before the world tears them apart? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The frigid Colorado night wrapped around the saloon like a bitter shroud. Lantern lights spilled across weathered wooden planks, casting long shadows that danced with each gust of winter wind. Inside, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke and cruel laughter as men gathered for what they saw as evening entertainment. Samantha May stood trembling near the bar, her arms crossed protectively over her body. Each jeering voice cut deeper than the last as rough men bid pennies for her, mocking her size with every offer. Her father swayed nearby, whiskey bottle clutched. In his grimy hand, his bloodshot eyes gleaming with greed. "Look at the size of her. Ain't worth the feed she'd eat," one man called out, drawing snickers from the crowd. "2 bits," another offered with a smirk. "Might make decent kitchen help if she don't eat all the provisions first." Tears burned in Samantha's eyes, but she blinked them back. 17 years of her father's neglect had taught her that showing weakness only brought more cruelty. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she shifted her weight, wishing she could sink through them and disappear. "$50," someone shouted from the back, followed by more laughter. The saloon door swung open, letting in a blast of cold air that made the lanterns flutter. Edward Cutter's tall frame filled the doorway, his buckskin jacket dusted with snow. The room grew quieter as he stepped inside. Folks knew of him, the half-shown mountain man who kept to himself out in the valley. Scars marked his weathered face, telling tales of bears and battles that no one dared ask about. Edward's dark eyes took in the scene, settling first on Samantha's father, then on her. Something flickered across his expression. Not the mockery she'd seen all evening, but something deeper. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single silver dollar. The coin caught the lamplight as it spun through the air, landing with a clear ring on the bar top. $1, Edward said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room. Snickers rippled through the crowd. "Wasting good silver on that one," someone muttered. But Edward didn't acknowledge them. He kept his eyes on Samantha's father, who stumbled forward to snatch up the coin. After squinting at it blearily, her father nodded and waved his hand dismissively. "She's yours then. Good riddance." Edward turned to face the room, his presence commanding attention without raising his voice. "By spring," he declared steadily, "you'll birth our sons." Samantha's face burned hot despite the cold. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the implications of his words sank in. The other men's crude offers had left little doubt about their intentions, but Edward's declaration spoke of something else entirely: marriage, family, a future she'd never dared imagine. He moved toward her then, his steps measured and careful, like approaching a spooked horse. When he reached her, he removed his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The leather was warm from his body and smelled of wood smoke and pine. Without a word, he guided her toward the door. The crowd parted before them, their earlier mockery turned to confused silence. As they stepped out into the night, Samantha heard whispers start up behind them, but Edward's steady presence beside her made them seem less important. The moon hung high and bright, painting silver paths across the snow-covered street. Their boots crunched in perfect rhythm as Edward led her away from town. Each step took her further from everything she'd known, toward an uncertain future with this strange, quiet man. Fear and hope warred in her chest. Would he prove different from the others who'd only seen her size and judged her worthless? Or would his gentleness vanish once they reached his cabin? The questions pressed heavy on her mind as they walked in silence, the only sounds their footsteps, and the distant cry of a coyote. Edward maintained a pace she could follow without struggle, never hurrying her or showing impatience. When she stumbled on a hidden route, his hand appeared at her elbow, steadying her without comment. The simple courtesy brought fresh tears to her eyes. They walked for what seemed hours, the town's lights fading behind them as they followed a trail through snow-laden pines. Just before dawn, when the eastern sky had barely begun to lighten, Edward's cabin appeared ahead. It sat sturdy and square against the wilderness, smoke curling from its stone chimney into the pre-dawn air. Samantha's steps slowed as they approached. This moment would reveal Edward's true nature, whether he'd be like all the others who'd seen only her flaws, or if somehow, impossibly, he might be the answer to prayers she'd stopped believing would be answered. Inside the cabin, warmth from the stone fireplace wrapped around Samantha like a gentle embrace. Edward moved with quiet purpose, gathering wood to build up the flames until they danced high and bright. Without a word, he took a thick patchwork quilt from a chest and laid it carefully by the hearth. "Sit," he said softly, gesturing to the quilt. "Get warm." Samantha lowered herself onto the soft fabric, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. The firelight cast flickering shadows across the cabin's interior, revealing neat shelves stocked with provisions, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and a few books carefully arranged on a small table. Everything spoke of order and care, so different from the chaos of her father's house. Edward moved to the cooking area, where a pot hung near the fire. The rich smell of stew made Samantha's stomach clench with hunger. She watched him ladle a generous portion into a bowl, her anxiety mounting with each passing moment. Surely now he would demand what he'd paid for, what men always wanted. But when he brought her the bowl, along with a thick slice of bread, he simply placed them in her hands and stepped back. "Eat," he said. "You need it." Her fingers trembled around the warm bowl as she waited for the other shoe to drop. The stew smelled wonderful, chunks of venison and vegetables and a rich broth, but fear made it hard to swallow. Edward settled onto a chair across from her, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I know you're scared," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I didn't buy you for what those men wanted. I couldn't leave you to that fate." Samantha's spoon halted halfway to her mouth. Then, "Why?" Edward's scarred face softened as he gazed into the fire. 7 years ago, I had a wife, Sarah Two Rivers. She was Shoshone, beautiful, strong. Pain flickered across his features. Fever took her and our unborn child. Since then, I've learned the Lord sometimes brings broken people together for healing. Tears welled in Samantha's eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks and onto the quilt. The kindness in his words, so unexpected after years of her father's cruelty, broke something loose inside her. She lifted the spoon with shaking hands and took a bite of stew, then another. Edward had called her broken, but somehow it didn't sound like an insult coming from him. "Eat your fill," he said, noticing how she tried to ration the food out of. "Had it. There's plenty more." It had been years since anyone had encouraged her to eat freely. Her father had always begrudged her every morsel, claiming her size was a waste of good provisions. But here was Edward, offering food without judgment or strings attached. The stew warmed her from the inside out, and gradually the knot of tension in her chest began to loosen. Edward didn't move from his chair or make any demands. He simply sat, occasionally adding wood to the fire, his presence becoming oddly comforting in its steadiness. When she finished eating, he took her bowl without comment and moved to the far side of the cabin. She watched as he spread his bedroll on the floor, maintaining a respectful distance that spoke louder than words. No man had ever shown such restraint around her before. "Sleep," he said, settling onto his bedroll. "You're safe here." Samantha pulled the quilt around her shoulders, hardly daring to believe this wasn't some dream she'd wake from to find herself back in her father's house. The fire crackled softly, its warmth and Edward's gentle breathing across the room lulling her into the first peaceful sleep she'd known in years. Dawn came with the soft patter of snow against the cabin's windows. Samantha stirred, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then the events of the night came rushing back, along with new scents that made her stomach rumble. Coffee brewing and fresh bread baking. She sat up to find Edward already at work in the cooking area, his movements quiet and efficient. A loaf of bread cooled on the table, and the coffee pot steamed promisingly on the stove. He'd let her sleep while he prepared breakfast. Another small kindness that threatened to bring tears to her eyes dawned as she watched him move about the cabin in the early morning light. Samantha felt the weight of understanding settle over her. This wasn't just a temporary refuge. This was the beginning of something entirely new. Edward hadn't saved her out of lust or desire to use her. He'd saved her because he saw something in her worth saving. The snow continued to fall outside, adding fresh white to the world, and Samantha felt her own life shifting just as surely as the landscape. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that seemed dangerously close to hope. Morning sunlight streamed through the cabin's frosted windows as Edward showed Samantha how to hold the hatchet. "Like this," he said, positioning her hands on the wooden handle. "Keep your thumb along the side, not wrapped around. That's it." The tool felt awkward in her grip. She'd never been trusted with anything sharper than a butter knife before. Edward placed a small log on the chopping block and stepped back. "Take your time. Aim for the center." Samantha raised the hatchet, her arms trembling slightly. The first swing barely scratched the wood. She felt her face flush with embarrassment, but Edward's voice remained steady. "That's fine. Try again. More force from your shoulder, not just your arms." The second strike bit deeper. By the fifth attempt, the log split with a satisfying crack. Pride bloomed in her chest as Edward nodded approval. "Well done. Each piece you split means warmth for the cabin." He gathered the kindling she'd made. "Now let's see to the stove." Inside, Edward demonstrated how to layer the wood and adjust the damper. Too much air, fire burns too hot. Too little, it smothers. His scarred hands moved with practiced ease. Fires, like people sometimes, needs the right balance to thrive. Samantha absorbed his patient instruction, determined to learn. When she successfully got the stove drying properly, Edward's quiet, "Good work," made her stand a little straighter. The afternoon light had turned golden when the sound of approaching horses broke the peaceful quiet. Samantha recognized the particular rhythm of her father's mar, the slight drag in its left hind step. Her stomach clenched with fear. Edward's expression hardened as he looked out the window. 3 riders approached her father, flanked by 2 men she recognized from town. All carried rifles. "Stay inside," Edward said softly, reaching for his own rifle by the door. He picked up his warm Bible from the table, then stepped onto the porch. Samantha pressed herself against the wall. Beside the window, trembling but unable to look away, her father's voice carried clearly, slurred with whiskey despite the early hour. "Came to get my property back, half-breed." "She's not property," Edward replied, his voice level. "She's under my protection now." One of the other men spat into the snow. "Protection? From a savage's son? You ain't got no right to white man's land or daughters." Edward didn't rise to the bait. He simply held up his Bible. God's law says different. Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and oppressed. Don't you quote scripture at me? Samantha's father roared. "That worthless girl ain't nothing but dead weight. Eating more than she's worth. Taking up space. You got swindled, Indian." "The Lord directs our paths," Edward answered. "He brought her here for a reason." The third man raised his rifle slightly. "Reason ain't gonna stop bullets, Breed." Edward didn't flinch. "No, but the law might interest Marshal Peters. He's due tomorrow regular patrol. I reckon he'd be mighty curious about a father selling his daughter for whiskey money." A tense silence followed. Samantha held her breath, watching her father's face darken with rage. Finally, he yanked his horse's head around. "Ain't worth the bullet," he growled. "But this ain't over. That useless girl will drag you down same as she did me." He spurred his horse, spraying snow as he wheeled away. His companions followed, one calling back, "Watch your back, Breed." Edward stood on the porch until the sound of hooves faded. Only then did he lower the Bible and return inside. Samantha burst into tears. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I'm nothing but trouble. They'll come back. You shouldn't have to deal with this because of me." Edward set his rifle back in its place with careful hands. "No need for sorry. You belong here now." He moved to the stove, adding wood to the fire she'd helped build earlier. "Their threats are just wind. The Lord guides my path, and he led me to that auction for a reason." Samantha wiped her eyes, watching as he began preparing their evening meal. Simple ingredients: beans, cornmeal, a bit of salt pork, but her hands steadied as she helped him cook. They ate their supper in silence, but it wasn't the fearful silence she'd known all her life. This quiet felt different, like a warm blanket wrapped around them both, keeping the cold world at bay. The beans and cornbread were plain fare, but sitting across from Edward, watching the lamplight play across his scarred features, Samantha felt oddly at peace. He'd stood up for her, claimed her as someone worth protecting. Not property to be bought and sold, but a person. The knowledge settled deep in her chest, warm as the fire they'd built together. The morning after her father's threats, frost sparkled on the cabin windows like scattered diamonds. Edward led Samantha outside, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. He handed her the axe again, this time showing her how to swing with her whole body. "Let the weight of the blade do the work," he explained, demonstrating the motion. "No need to force it." Samantha's first few attempts glanced off the logs. Her hands, soft from years of indoor work, quickly developed red spots that would soon become blisters. Still, she persisted, remembering Edward's defense of her yesterday. Each successful split brought a small spark of satisfaction. "Good," Edward said simply when she managed to cleave a log clean through. His quiet approval meant more than any praise she'd ever received. Next came the chickens, scratching in their snow-clear pen. Edward showed her how to scatter feed in a wide arc, keeping her movements slow and steady. "They're nervous creatures," he explained. "But treat them gentle. They'll reward you with eggs." The water barrel needed filling next. Samantha struggled with the heavy buckets, splashing icy water down her dress. Twice she slipped in the snow, soaking herself thoroughly. But Edward never laughed at her clumsiness. He simply helped her up and showed her how to balance the yoke. Across her shoulders, by midday, her muscles ached, but pride warmed her chest. Edward had brought home a rabbit the day before, and she set about making it into stew, adding wild onions and the last of the autumn carrots from his root cellar. As they sat down to eat, Edward spooned up a mouthful and nodded. "This is good," he said. Been a while since I had proper cooking. Samantha ducked her head, pleased. My father never, she began, then hesitated. Edward waited patiently while she found her words. He always said I ate too much to waste food. On learning to cook, said I'd just eat all the mistakes. Edward's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed gentle. Some men's hearts grow bitter as winter berries. Their words poison only themselves. Have you? Samantha stirred her stew. Have you been alone long? Since your wife? A shadow crossed Edward's face. 2 winters now. The silence. He looked around the cabin. It echoes some days. Before Samantha could respond, a soft thump sounded against the cabin wall. Edward was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. His tension eased as he looked out. Little Hawk, he said, recognition in his voice. He opened the door, revealing a small boy huddled against the cabin. The child's clothes were wet with snow, his face pinched with cold. Edward spoke a few words in what Samantha assumed was the Ute language. The boy answered, his voice shaky. He's from the winter camp over. The ridge, Edward explained to Samantha. Got turned around in the woods. He knows me from trading with his people. Samantha was already moving, grabbing a blanket from near the fire. She wrapped it around the shivering child and guided him to sit by the stove. His dark eyes watched her warily until she brought him a bowl of hot stew. Careful, she said softly. It's hot. She demonstrated by blowing on a spoonful. The boy copied her action, then smiled as he tasted the warm broth. Edward watched them with approval. I'll need to ride him back before full dark. His family will be worried. While Little Hawk ate, Samantha heated more broth and found a pair of worn but dry wool socks. The boy's own footwear was soaked through. She helped him change them, noting how he relaxed under her gentle care. After the boy had warmed up and eaten his fill, Edward saddled his horse. You'll be all right here, he asked Samantha. She nodded, touched by his concern. I'll keep the fire going. Edward lifted Little Hawk onto the horse, wrapping him in an extra blanket. With a final nod to Samantha, they rode off into the gathering dusk. Alone in the cabin for the first time, Samantha busied herself with tidying up. She added wood to the fire, just as Edward had taught her, feeling a small thrill of accomplishment when the flames caught perfectly. The silence felt different now, not threatening, but peaceful. She had just put the last bowl away when Edward returned. Snow dusted his shoulders as he stamped his boots clean. Little Hawk's family sends their thanks, he said, hanging up his coat. You showed good heart today. Kindness needs no common language. Samantha blushed at the praise, but stood straighter. For the first time in her life, she felt truly useful, not just taking up space, as her father always claimed, but actually helping others. The thought warmed her more than any fire could. The day settled into a gentle rhythm as winter tightened its grip on the valley. Each morning, Samantha rose before dawn to help Edward with the chores. Her blisters hardened into calluses as she learned to swing the axe with growing confidence. The woodpile grew steadily, standing ready against the deepening cold. Edward proved to be a patient teacher. He showed her how to bank the stove's fire to last through the night, and which pieces of kindling would catch best. When she dropped an armful of logs, scattering them across the snow, he simply helped her gather them without comment. The first big storm caught them mid-morning, turning the air white with swirling snow. They hurried to shelter the chickens and ensure the barn was secure before retreating to the cabin. As the wind howled outside, Edward lit the lamp and settled into his chair by the fire. From a drawer, he pulled out a piece of pine wood and a small knife. Samantha watched, fascinated, as his skilled hands began to shape the wood. Shavings curled away from the blade, revealing the form of what might become a bird. The lamplight cast his scarred face in shadow, But his expression was peaceful. She found her own hands wanting occupation and remembered the pile of Edward's clothes needing mending. The familiar task of threading a needle brought comfort as the storm raged. They worked in companionable silence, broken only by the crack of logs in the fire and the soft scrape of knife on wood. When the weather cleared, Edward taught her to set snares for rabbits. Step light, he cautioned, demonstrating how to move through the snow. Animals hear better than you'd think. Samantha tried to copy his careful movements, but stumbled, sending a young deer bounding away through the trees. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment until she heard something unexpected, Edward's low chuckle. The sound startled her into her own laugh, rusty from disuse but genuine. "First time I tried hunting," Edward said, "I fell face first into a stream. My wife never let me forget it." The mention of his late wife didn't carry the same sharp edge of grief it had before. Samantha found herself smiling more often, though sometimes the expression still felt strange on her face. Nights brought new challenges. Wolves haunted the darkness beyond the cabin walls, their howls rising with the moon. The first time Samantha heard them, she nearly jumped out of her skin. Edward looked up from his carving, noting her fear. "They won't come near while the fire burns," he assured her. "Besides, they're just talking to each other, like people do." His calm presence helped ease her fears. She began to hear the beauty in the wolves' songs, a wild harmony that spoke of spaces bigger than her small world had been. One evening, as another storm pressed close around the cabin, Edward set aside his carving. The firelight caught the silver threads in his dark hair as he spoke softly. "My wife, Snowflower, she used to say the Creator sends broken ones to mend each other." He traced a finger along a crack in the wooden table. "Like these boards, split apart, but stronger where they're joined again." Samantha's hand stilled on her mending. Was she very wise? She saw truth in simple things. Edward's voice held warmth. "Said pain either hardens your heart or opens it wider. The choice is yours." The words settled deep in Samantha's chest, like seeds waiting for spring. She thought of her father's bitterness, how it had poisoned everything. It touched. Then she looked at Edward, who had taken his own grief and turned it to kindness. That night, as the storm quieted to gentle snowfall, Edward did something new. He took his Bible from its shelf and opened it carefully. "Would you like to pray with me?" he asked. Samantha hesitated. Her father had used religion like a weapon, quoting scripture to prove her worthlessness. But Edward's invitation held no judgment, only quiet welcome. I haven't prayed in years," she admitted. "The Lord hasn't forgotten how to listen." Slowly, Samantha bowed her head. Edward's voice was gentle as he thanked the Creator for shelter, food, and new beginnings. When he finished, Samantha whispered her own words of gratitude, for safety, for kindness, for the chance to become something more than what she'd been told she was as she lay down to sleep that night. Wrapped in her quilt by the fire, Samantha felt something unfamiliar stirring in her heart. It took her a while to recognize it as hope. The winter storm finally broke, leaving the valley sparkling under fresh snow. Edward announced it was time to attend Sunday service in town. Samantha's stomach nodded at the thought, but she knew. They needed supplies. Early Sunday morning, Edward hitched the wagon while Samantha wrapped herself in her warmest clothes. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her dress, the same one she'd worn the night of the auction. Edward noticed her distress and paused in his work. "The Lord sees hearts, not appearances," he said quietly. The wagon creaked through the crisp morning air, their breath forming clouds in the cold. As they approached town, Samantha's anxiety grew. The streets were busy with folks heading to church, and heads turned as Edward guided the wagon down the main street. Whispers followed them like shadows. "There's that fat girl from the auction," one woman muttered to another. "And the half-breed who bought her," came the reply. Samantha's cheeks burned, and she started to slide down in her seat. Edward's hand found hers, warm and steady. "Sit tall," he murmured. "You've nothing to be ashamed of." The church stood white against the blue sky, its bell calling people to worship. Edward helped Samantha down from the wagon, keeping her hand firmly in his as they walked up the steps. More whispers rustled through the congregation, but Edward's grip never wavered. They found a pew near the back. Pastor Carter stood at the pulpit, his weathered face kind as he surveyed his flock. When the first hymn was announced, Samantha knew the tune. Her mother had sung it long ago, before the fever took her. The organ wheezed to life, and the congregation began to sing. Samantha's voice emerged tentatively at first, barely a whisper. But as the familiar words washed over her, something deep inside began to unfurl. Her voice grew stronger, pure and clear, rising above the general chorus. People turned to look, surprise replacing judgment on their faces. The pastor's eyebrows rose, and a smile touched his lips as he conducted the hymn. Edward's hand squeezed hers gently. Through the service, Samantha felt herself slowly relaxing. Pastor Carter's sermon spoke of God's love for all his children, regardless of their earthly circumstances. His eyes seemed to meet hers several times as he spoke of grace and redemption. After the final blessing, Edward guided them toward the mercantile for supplies. As they crossed the street, an older widow, Mrs. Henderson, Samantha would later learn, approached them. "My dear," the widow said, her lined face gentle, "I haven't heard such a lovely voice in our choir loft for many years. You must join us next Sunday." Samantha blushed, stammering her thanks. The simple compliment felt like cool water on parched ground. In the mercantile, Edward efficiently gathered their needed supplies: flour, coffee, salt, and ammunition. Samantha helped him choose sturdy fabric for new curtains. As she waited by the counter, her eyes fell on a deep blue shawl, soft as cloud wisps. She touched it briefly before pulling her hand away, knowing such pretty things weren't meant for girls like her. Edward saw. Without a word, he added the shawl to their purchases. When Samantha tried to protest, he simply shook his head. "A voice like yours deserves something fine to wrap it in." The ride home was quiet, but different from their first journey together. Samantha held the wrapped shawl in her lap, fingers tracing the paper package. The sun was setting as they reached the cabin, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. After they'd unloaded the wagon and settled the horses, Samantha stood alone in her corner of the cabin. Slowly, she unwrapped the shawl, letting its soft folds drape around her shoulders. The wool was finer than anything she'd ever owned. Tears began to fall, not the bitter tears of shame she'd known so often, but something else entirely. Gratitude welled up inside her for Edward's quiet respect, for the pastor's welcoming smile, for the widow's kind words. For the first time in years, she felt like more than just the fat girl everyone scorned. Edward busied himself with the fire, giving her privacy and her emotion, but his presence was a comfort, solid as the cabin walls around them. The shawl hugged her shoulders like a gentle embrace, and Samantha let herself weep freely, not for what she'd lost, but for what she might be beginning to find. The weeks flowed like spring thaw, winter's grip loosening day by day. Patches of grass emerged from beneath the melting snow, and morning bird song replaced the whistle of bitter wind. As Easter Sunday approached, Samantha noticed changes beyond the season. She walked taller now, her steps sure on the path between cabin and barn. Easter morning dawned clear and bright. Samantha stood before the small mirror Edward had brought her, carefully arranging the blue shawl over her best dress. Her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed the soft wool. The woman in the mirror looked different from the frightened girl who'd arrived in winter. Her cheeks held color now, her eyes clearer. Edward waited by the wagon, dressed in his finest shirt, his dark hair neatly combed. He offered his hand to help her up, as always, but today his smile held something warmer. The drive to town felt different too. Anticipation, rather than dread, fluttered in Samantha's chest. The church gleamed white in the morning sun, festooned with early spring flowers. Ladies in their Easter finery climbed the steps, parasols twirling, while men in polished boots and pressed suits helped children from wagons. Samantha noticed their stares seemed less harsh today. The whispers still followed their path, too. The church door inside. Sunlight streamed through windows onto fresh-swept floors. Pastor Carter stood greeting his flock, and his welcome to Edward and Samantha rang genuine. They found their usual pew, now feeling almost like home. Samantha smoothed her shawl, drawing comfort from its familiar softness. When the organ's first notes filled the church, Samantha's heart lifted. The opening hymn was one she knew by heart. Christ the Lord is risen today. She drew a deep breath as the congregation stood. Edward's shoulder brushed hers, steady and encouraging. Her voice rose clear as morning light, carrying the ancient words of resurrection and hope. The usual whispers stilled. Other voices faltered, then joined hers with growing strength. The hymn swelled, filling every corner of the church with joy. Samantha felt something shift in the air. Faces that had shown scorn now turned to her with wonder. Mrs. Henderson, leading the choir, nodded in approval. Even the most critical church ladies seemed moved. For one shining hour, she wasn't the auction girl or the fat one. She was simply a voice lifting praise to heaven. The service passed in a blur of scripture readings and prayers. Samantha's voice soared through each hymn, growing stronger rather than tiring. She caught Edward watching her more than once, pride plain in his eyes. After the final blessing, people lingered to share Easter greetings. Several approached to compliment Samantha's singing. Pastor Carter's wife insisted she must join the choir. Through it all, Edward stayed close, his presence both shield and support. Then, before everyone's eyes, Edward took her hand in his, not helping her down steps or into the wagon, simply holding it, fingers interlaced, declaring his choice to all who watched. Samantha's heart skipped. Some townsfolk frowned, but others smiled, particularly those who'd been moved by her songs. The drive home felt lighter than air. Spring sunshine warmed their shoulders as Edward guided the horses through greening valleys. They spoke little, but the silence held comfort rather than awkwardness at the cabin. Edward surprised her by producing a special Easter dinner he'd prepared before church. A roasted chicken, fresh bread, and even a small cake. The table looked festive with wildflowers he must have gathered at dawn. They ate together, sharing memories of Easters past. Edward spoke of celebrating with his Shoshone wife's people, while Samantha recalled her mother's traditions. For the first time, laughter came easily between them, natural as breathing as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor. Samantha found herself studying Edward's face, the strong lines softened by firelight, the gentle way he listened when she spoke. Something warm and unexpected bloomed in her heart. She allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine more springs like this, more shared meals, more easy laughter. A future where she belonged not just in this cabin, but at this man's side. That night, as she lay in her bed, listening to the spring peepers sing, Samantha whispered her first truly hopeful prayer in years. "Thank you, Lord," she breathed into the darkness, "for bringing me home." The words surprised her, but she knew it was true. Somehow, between winter and spring, this place had become home. Edward's steady breathing from across the room mingled with the chorus of frogs outside. Samantha pulled her shawl closer, its softness a reminder of the day's acceptance, of belonging, of possibility. Sleep came gentle as an Easter blessing, carrying her toward tomorrow on wings of newfound peace. Morning light barely touched the valley when the sound of Approaching horses broke the dawn quiet. Edward stood on the porch, coffee cup in hand, watching as a group of men rode toward the cabin. Samantha's heart dropped when she recognized her father among them, his hateful sneer visible even at a distance. 3 well-dressed men dismounted first, pulling surveying equipment from their saddlebags. They carried themselves with the authority of railroad men, their clothes too fine for regular ranch work. The tallest one, wearing a black bowler hat, pulled papers from his leather satchel. Edward Cutter? The man's voice carried across the yard. We represent the Western Pacific Railroad Company. These documents show our claim to this valley. Edward set his cup down slowly, his face betraying nothing. This land's been mine 5 years now. Got the papers to prove it. Samantha's father spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Ain't proper land for a half-breed living in sin with my worthless girl. The railroad man held up his papers. According to our surveys, this valley falls under railroad grant lands. We'll be laying track through here by summer's end. Edward took the documents, reading carefully while the surveyors began setting up their equipment. Samantha watched from the doorway, her stomach churning with familiar shame as her father's eyes found her. Look at her, he sneered to the railroad men. Fat as ever. Probably eating this poor fool out of house and home. The surveyors chuckled, and Samantha felt her face burn. She retreated inside, but not before seeing Edward's jaw tighten at their cruel words. Later that morning, Samantha walked to the mercantile for supplies, trying to hold her head high despite the stares. As she gathered items from the shelves, Mrs. Peterson's sharp voice carried from the next aisle. Living together unmarried, it's a scandal, and her, big as a house. What kind of man takes up with such a creature? That half-breed Cutter's no better than she is, another woman replied. Serves him right to lose that land. Samantha's hands shook as she placed her items on the counter. The shopkeeper's wife barely looked at her while counting out change. Outside, she pressed herself against the building's wall, fighting tears. Through the window, she heard her father's voice inside the store. That girl's proof enough of his character, he was saying. No decent man would keep her. When the judge hears how he's living, he'll throw out any claim to that land right quick. Samantha's chest tightened. The supplies felt heavy in her arms as she hurried back to the cabin, her father's words echoing with each step. Edward was checking his trap lines, the cabin empty when she arrived. She sank into a chair, mind racing. All those weeks of feeling, almost worthy, almost belonging, they crumbled like dry leaves. Edward would lose everything because of her. His land, his reputation, his chance at a real life. The afternoon passed in a fog of guilt and shame. When Edward returned, she could barely meet his eyes. He spoke of fighting the railroad's claim, of taking their case to the territorial court. But Samantha heard only the cost her presence would bring him. After supper, Edward prepared to check his far trap line, an overnight trip he made twice each month. Samantha watched him pack, her decision crystallizing like frost on a window. I'll be back tomorrow evening, he said, touching her shoulder gently. Don't worry about the railroad. Men, the Lord provides. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Edward mounted his horse and rode into the gathering dusk, unaware of the tears sliding down her cheeks as soon as his figure disappeared into the trees. Samantha began to pack. She wrapped bread, dried meat, and a small pot in a blanket, adding a flint for fires. Her hands trembled as she wrote a note. Dear Edward, I'm sorry for bringing shame to you. You can't lose your land because of me. I'll go to the Ute camp. They were kind to me when Little Hawk came. Please don't look for me. You deserve better than a worthless girl who only causes trouble. Thank you for showing me kindness. Samantha. She placed the note on the table, then took one last look around the cabin that had briefly felt like home. The quilt he'd given her that first night still lay folded by the fire. She touched it once, then turned away. The spring night was cold as Samantha slipped out the door. Stars pricked the dark sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. She knew the way to the Ute camp from Edward's descriptions. Follow the creek north until the 3 tall pines. Then east toward the rising moon. Her feet felt heavy as lead, but she forced them forward. Each step away from the cabin drove Edward's gentle voice deeper into memory. But she kept walking, convinced that her absence would free him, to defend his land without the burden of her shame. The moon rose higher as Samantha disappeared into the darkness, leaving only emptiness behind in the warm cabin where she had finally begun to feel worthy of love. Moonlight filtered through bare branches as Samantha stumbled through patches of melting snow. Her legs ached, and the bundle of supplies felt heavier with each step. Smoke rose faintly in the distance. The Ute camp, she hoped, though it seemed impossibly far away. The spring night air bit through her shawl, the one Edward had given her in town. She clutched it tighter, fighting back tears at the memory of his kindness. A broken branch caught her foot, and she stumbled, catching herself against a tree trunk. Her hands scraped against the rough bark, but she pushed on. In the darkness, wolves began to howl. The sound echoed off the valley walls, closer than she'd expected. Samantha's heart pounded as she quickened her pace, remembering Edward's stories about wolf packs growing bold near winter's end when game grew scarce. The creek gurgled beside her path, its banks still lined with patches of dirty snow. She followed it northward, as Edward had taught her, looking for the 3 tall pines that would mark her turn eastward. The moon cast enough light to see, but exhaustion made her vision blur. Back at the cabin, Edward's horse carried him swiftly along his trapline, unaware of Samantha's absence. The night passed slowly as she pushed herself forward, each step harder than the last. Her legs trembled with fatigue, and her breath came in ragged gasps. Dawn painted the sky in pale colors when Samantha finally glimpsed the Ute camp through the trees. Smoke rose from several fires, and she could make out the shapes of tippets against the lightening sky. Her relief was overwhelming. She had made it, but her body had reached its limit. The last few hundred yards seemed impossible as black spots danced before her eyes. She stumbled again, this time falling to her knees in the snow. The bundle of supplies rolled away, scattering her food across the ground. At the cabin, Edward had just returned, his heart freezing when he found the note. Without hesitation, he saddled his freshest horse and began following her tracks through the melting snow. His prayers rose desperately as he urged his mount faster. "Lord, keep her safe," he whispered, scanning the ground for signs of her passage. "Please don't let me be too late." 2 Ute women spotted Samantha as she struggled toward their camp. They hurried to help her, speaking soft words she couldn't understand as they lifted her to her feet. Their strong hands guided her toward the nearest fire, where they wrapped her in warm blankets. Samantha tried to thank them, but exhaustion overwhelmed her. She swayed on her feet, the world tilting strangely. The women's concerned faces blurred as darkness crept into the edges of her vision. She thought she heard hoofbeats approaching, but couldn't be sure if it was real or her imagination. Her legs finally gave out. She collapsed just outside the fire circle, the blankets tangling around her as she fell. The last thing she heard was Edward's voice calling her name, panic making it crack with emotion. Edward leaped from his horse before it fully stopped, running to where Samantha lay crumpled in the snow. His hand shook as he gathered her into his arms, checking for breath. She was cold, too cold, but alive. "I've got you," he whispered, cradling her close as the Ute women brought more blankets. "I've got you now." The morning sun rose fully over the valley as Edward held Samantha, his prayers of desperate fear turning to prayers of thanks. He had found her in time. Whatever had driven her to flee Whatever shame or fear had sent her into the deadly cold, they would face it together. Inside the Ute Lodge, warmth from the central fire barely reached Samantha's bones. She lay wrapped in buffalo robes, shivering despite the heat. Edward knelt beside her, his scarred hands pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. Her skin burned with fever, making the world swim in and out of focus. Two Ute women moved quietly. Around them, brewing herbs in a clay pot that filled the lodge with a sharp, medicinal scent. They whispered in their language, sharing concerned glances as Samantha's teeth chattered. One brought a cup of steaming liquid to Edward, gesturing for him to help Samantha drink. Edward's hands trembled as he lifted her head. "Please," he whispered, "just a few sips." His voice caught as memories of his first wife's final fever surfaced. "Lord, not again. Please don't take another wife from me." Samantha managed a few swallows before turning away, her throat too tight, with unshed tears. The bitter herbs settled in her stomach as Edward lowered her head back to the buffalo robe. His normally steady presence seemed shaken, fear evident in the way he watched her every breath. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice rough from cold and exhaustion. "I never meant—" She broke off, coughing. Edward leaned closer. "Why did you run, Samantha? What drove you out into that deadly cold?" She closed her eyes, shame washing over. The railroad men. Father's schemes." Her words came in broken gasps. "You'll lose everything because of me. Your land, your respect." Tears slid down her temples. "I heard them in town. They say you're ruined, taking in someone like me. Someone like you?" Edward's voice grew firm. "What do you mean by that?" Samantha turned her face away, but Edward gently cupped her cheek, turning her back to meet his gaze. The Ute women paused in their work, watching the exchange with knowing eyes. "I'm not," Samantha's voice broke. "I'm not worthy of sons. Not worthy of love or a future. Look at me. Fat, useless, a burden." The words tumbled out in a rush of pain. "You promised them sons by spring, but I'll only bring you shame. Better to leave than watch you lose everything because of me." Edward's hand tightened on hers. "Listen well, Samantha May." His voice carried the quiet authority that had first drawn her attention that terrible night outside the saloon. "Your worth isn't measured by your size or your usefulness. It's not counted in sons or acres or what other folks might say." The older of the Ute women nodded, speaking soft words in her language that made Edward pause and smile slightly before continuing. "God made you precious," he said, his thumb gently wiping tears from her cheek. "He formed you with purpose, with a heart that shows kindness to lost children and strength to endure cruel words. When I spoke of sons that night, it wasn't a demand. It was a promise of hope. Hope that together we might build something new from our broken pieces." Samantha's tears flowed freely now. The younger Ute woman brought another blanket, tucking it around her with maternal care. Edward's words washed over her like healing rain on parched earth. "But your land," she protested weakly. "The railroad's claims. Land can be fought for," Edward said firmly. "Or new land found if need be. But you," his voice softened, "you are irreplaceable. When I found your tracks in the snow, my heart nearly stopped. All the land in Colorado means nothing if I lose you." The older Ute woman spoke again, longer this time. Edward listened intently, then translated for Samantha. "She says the Creator gives each soul its proper shape, like different plants in the valley. Some tall as aspens, some round as berry bush, all needed, all worthy of the sun's warmth." Samantha's tears came harder, but they were different now. Not tears of shame or fear, but of release. Edward gathered her carefully in his arms, mindful of her weakness, and held her as she wept. The Ute women moved quietly around them, adding herbs. to the fire that filled the lodge with sweet smoke. "I thought," Samantha whispered against Edward's chest, "I thought if I left, you could find someone better. Someone worthy of your name." Edward's arms tightened around her. "You are worthy," he said firmly. "Not because of what you can do or be, but because God declares it so. And he paused, his own voice rough with emotion. "I declare it too, before these witnesses and the Lord himself." The Ute women smiled approvingly at his words, nodding as they tended the fire. Samantha's tears gradually slowed, exhaustion pulling at her again. But as she drifted towards sleep in Edward's arms, something hard and frozen inside her began to thaw. For the first time, she felt truly seen, not for her size or her skills or what sons she might bear, but for herself alone. Edward continued to hold her, his prayers now mixing gratitude with his earlier pleading. He had found her in time, and with God's help, he would help her find herself as well. As evening shadows lengthened in the Ute lodge, Chief Iron Bear entered silently, his weathered face solemn in the firelight. He carried a leather pouch close to his chest, watching Edward tend to Samantha with thoughtful eyes. The two Ute women who had been caring for Samantha bowed their heads respectfully as the chief settled near the fire. Edward looked up, recognizing the gravity in Iron Bear's presence. The chief spoke in measured tones, his words carrying the weight of years. Edward listened intently, then translated for Samantha, who lay propped against buffalo robes, her color slightly better after the healing herbs. "The chief says he has watched you since you married into his cousin's people," Edward explained softly. "He says your heart walks in two worlds, like his does." Iron Bear reached into his leather pouch, withdrawing a carefully folded paper, yellow with age. The firelight caught the official seals and faded ink as he slowly unfolded it. Edward's eyes widened in recognition. "The 1854 treaty," he breathed, hardly daring to touch the document Iron Bear now held out. "I thought all copies were lost in the agency fire." Samantha struggled to sit up straighter, her weakness forgotten in the moment's importance. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice still rough from her ordeal. Edward carefully took the treaty, holding it so she could see. "This treaty marks the boundaries of Ute territory," he explained, "including the valley where our cabin stands." His finger traced a line of faded text. "The railroad can't claim land that was already granted by treaty." Iron Bear spoke again, his words deliberate. Edward's face grew serious as he translated. "He says the paper talkers in Washington may forget their promises, but the people remember. Every stream, every valley. They remember who hunted there, who lived there, who died there." Edward paused, emotion thick in his voice. "Because I married his cousin's daughter, because I respected their ways and kept their stories, he counts me as kin. The valley is mine by right of marriage and honor." Samantha's hand found Edward's, squeezing weakly. "Then your claim is stronger than the railroad's," she whispered. "Stronger than any paper my father might wave about." Iron Bear nodded, speaking again. This time, he addressed Samantha directly, though she needed Edward's translation to understand. "He says you have shown courage, both in running to protect what you love and in surviving the cold to reach here." Edward's voice carried the chief's approval. "He says such strength deserves respect, not mockery." Tears welled in Samantha's eyes as Iron Bear continued. Through Edward, his words carried ancient wisdom. "The people know that the fattest berry bush often bears the sweetest fruit. The railroad men and your father see only what their greed allows them to see. They have forgotten how to look with true eyes." The chief carefully refolded the treaty, but instead of returning it to his pouch, he held it out to Edward. "He says, we must fight with truth, not violence," Edward translated, taking the precious document. The paper talkers respect their own marks more than they respect our words. So we will use their marks to protect what is ours. Samantha's fingers tightened around Edward's. Ours, she repeated softly, the word feeling strange but right on her tongue. For the first time, she felt truly part of something larger than her own fears. Iron Bear spoke one final time before rising to leave. Edward's voice grew husky as he translated. He says we are all treaty people now, bound by promises, strengthened by kinship, united against those who would break faith. The chief departed as silently as he had come, leaving Edward and Samantha alone with the two Ute women. The precious treaty lay across Edward's knee, its presence both a comfort and a call to action. Rest now, Edward told Samantha, tucking the buffalo robes more securely around her. At dawn, the people will escort us back. We'll face whatever comes together. Samantha nodded, exhaustion pulling at her again. But as she drifted towards sleep, her hand remained firmly in Edward's, the treaty paper rustling softly between them. The fire burned low, and outside the lodge, night birds called across the valley, their valley, protected by ancient promises and new bonds of love. Through the night, Edward kept vigil, the treaty secure in his possession. He watched Samantha sleep, her breathing stronger now, and silently thanked God for both the document's emergence and her survival. The Ute women maintained the fire, their quiet movements a comfort in the darkness. As first light touched the lodge's smoke hole, preparation began for the journey home. The Ute women helped wrap Samantha warmly, while warriors readied horses outside. Edward carefully stored the treaty inside his coat, close to his heart. They emerged from the lodge into dawn's pale light. A dozen mounted Ute warriors waited to escort them, their presence a clear message about whose land they defended. Iron Bear himself sat astride his horse at their head, his face set with determination. Samantha, still weak but determined, allowed Edward to help her onto their wagons. Seat. She sat tall despite her exhaustion, understanding now that she was part of this fight, not a burden to be cast aside, but a partner in defending their home. The morning sun rose over the valley as the procession moved out, hooves and wagon wheels crunching through patches of lingering snow. They headed toward town, toward confrontation, but they carried with them something stronger than force, the power of truth preserved on aging paper, and the strength of hearts bound together by love and justice. The Indian Agency building stood stark against the morning sky, its weathered boards and official signs a reminder of two worlds meeting. Inside the cramped courtroom, oil lamps cast yellow light over rough-hewn benches filled with townsfolk, railroad men, and a handful of Ute warriors who had stayed to witness. Edward stood straight before the clerk's desk, his broad shoulders squared beneath his clean work shirt. The treaty lay carefully unfolded on the scratched wooden surface. Beside him, Samantha sat in a chair, still pale from her ordeal, but determined to face what came. Judge Harrison peered through his wire-rimmed spectacles at the aged document, his finger tracing the faded ink with careful attention. The railroad men's lawyer, Mr. Phillips, shifted impatiently in his expensive suit, while Samantha's father slouched against the back wall, reeking of whiskey, even at this early hour. "This treaty appears authentic," Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying through the stuffy room. "The seals and signatures match our records." "Your Honor," Phillips interrupted, stepping forward with a sheaf of papers. "The railroad's claim supersedes any prior agreements. Progress cannot be held back by the law?" Edward's quiet voice cut through the lawyer's bluster. "By sacred promises made between nations?" The judge held up his hand for silence. "Mr. Cutter, you claim this land through marriage into the Ute people?" "Yes, sir." Edward's voice remained steady. "My wife was Walking Deer, cousin to Chief Iron Bear. Though she's gone to God now, the kinship remains. The treaty confirms the valley as Ute territory, and through marriage, I have rights to work that land." Samantha's father pushed away from the wall, swaying slightly. "That half-breed's got no right," he slurred. "And that worthless girl—" "Silence." Judge Harrison's gavel cracked sharply. "Mr. May, you'll hold your tongue or be removed." He turned to Samantha, his stern face softening slightly. "Miss May, do you wish to speak?" Samantha's hands trembled in her lap, but she stood, her voice carrying clear despite her weakness. "My father sold me for whiskey money," she said, meeting the judge's eyes. "He called me worthless all my life because of my size. But Edward—" She paused, gathering strength. "Edward Cutter bought me to save me. He's given me a home, taught me skills, shown me dignity. He's a good man who works his land honest and treats all folks fair." The courtroom had gone absolutely still. Even the railroad men looked uncomfortable at the raw truth in her words. "And what of his claim to the valley?" Judge Harrison prompted gently. "He knows every tree, every stream," Samantha continued. "He honors the old ways while working toward tomorrow. The Ute people trust him. He's earned that land through respect and kinship, not just paper claims." Her father lunged forward suddenly. "You ungrateful." Two Ute warriors stepped smoothly. Between him and Samantha, their presence alone enough to make him stumble back. Edward's hand found Samantha's shoulder, steadying her as she swayed slightly. Judge Harrison studied the treaty again, then looked at the railroad's documents. The room seemed to hold its breath. "The law must respect prior claims," he finally declared. "This treaty predates the railroad's interest. More importantly, it represents a sacred trust between peoples." He fixed Phillips with a stern look. "The railroad will need to adjust its route. Mr. Cutter's claim stands." A murmur ran through the crowd. Phillips spluttered protests about progress and profits, but the judge's gavel silenced him. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, regarding Miss May's situation, he glared at her father. "The sale of human beings is expressly forbidden. Mr. Cutter's intervention, while unorthodox, likely saved this young woman from worse fate. I hereby declare their arrangement legal and binding." The relief was too much. Samantha felt the room spin as weeks of fear and exhaustion caught up with her. Her knees buckled, but Edward's strong arms caught her before she could fall. Through the encroaching darkness, she heard the judge's voice continuing. "This court recognizes Edward Cutter's claim to the valley lands and his protection of Samantha May. Let it be recorded." Samantha's eyes fluttered open to find herself cradled in Edward's arms, his worried face swimming into focus above her. They were outside the agency building now, seated on a wooden bench in the fresh air. The Ute warriors stood nearby, their presence ensuring no interference from her father or the railroad men. "You're safe," Edward murmured, supporting her as she sat up slowly. "The judge ruled in our favor. The land is protected. Nobody can take you away." Samantha leaned against his strength, tears of relief sliding down her cheeks. Justice had prevailed. Not through violence, but through truth and honor. The treaty paper had done what force of arms never could, secured their future through the power of law and respect for ancient promises. Inside the agency building, they could hear the clerk recording the judge's decision, the scratch of his pen writing their victory into official record. Outside, spring sun warmed their faces as Edward held Samantha steady, their shared triumph quiet but complete. The mountain valley bloomed with new life as winter's grip loosened. Inside Edward's cabin, now their cabin, Samantha found her strength, returning day by day. Her hands, once soft from idleness, grew capable with honest work. Though still carrying the curves God gave her, she felt lighter in spirit as winter's weight melted away like the snow outside. Edward watched over her recovery with quiet dedication. Each morning, he brought her herbs gathered from the hillsides, brewing tea that smelled of pine and wild mint. His care showed in small ways: a fresh pillow of goose down, a wooden cup carved to fit her hands just right. Together, they worked the soil behind the cabin as soon as the ground softened. Edward showed her how to test the earth's readiness by squeezing a handful when it crumbled just right. They knew it was time. Side by side, they planted rows of peas, carrots, and beans. Samantha delighted in pressing each seed into the dark soil, imagining the green life sleeping within. "Like our hearts," she said softly one evening, watching the first sprouts break through. "Sometimes good things just need time to grow." The town's attitude shifted like the seasons. Mrs. Peterson from the Mercantile brought a basket of preserves, her eyes warm with genuine kindness. The pastor's wife delivered a patchwork quilt, rich with apology in every stitch. Even gruff old Mr. Turner, who'd once mocked Samantha's size, stopped by with seed potatoes and a gruffly muttered, "Welcome to the valley, proper-like." Then, one evening, Edward unveiled his surprise: a beautifully carved cradle, its pine wood, smooth as silk. Samantha ran her fingers over the delicate patterns of leaves and vines he'd worked into the headboard. "For when the time comes," he said simply, and her heart swelled with the promise of tomorrow. Their cabin had become more than shelter. It was a sanctuary where broken spirits mended, where hope took root as surely as their garden seeds, where two souls grew stronger together than they'd ever been alone. The garden path felt firm beneath Samantha's feet as she walked among the sprouting vegetables. Spring sunshine warmed her shoulders through the shawl Edward had given her months ago. She paused to admire the tender pea shoots climbing their stakes, remembering how different life had been when winter's cruel winds first brought her here. Edward appeared beside her, his shadow falling gentle across the tilled earth. His weathered hand found hers, rough calluses speaking of honest work and steadfast protection. Without words, he drew her close and placed her palm against her belly, where new life stirred beneath her apron. "By spring you'll birth our sons," he whispered, his voice rich with emotion. The words echoed their first meeting, but now held tenderness instead of challenge. Not by weight, nor men's laughter, but by the Lord's mercy. Tears welled in Samantha's eyes, but these were different from the bitter drops she'd shed in shame. So many times before, these spoke of joy, of belonging, of finally believing she was worthy of love. Edward's thumb gently brushed them away as they rolled down her cheeks. The evening air carried the sweet scent of wild roses and fresh-turned earth. From the valley below, church bells rang out clear and pure, their melody drifting up to bless the homestead that had become her sanctuary. Lamplight spilled from their cabin windows, golden and welcoming against the deepening dusk. Samantha leaned into Edward's embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Here was the truth that had always eluded her. Love saw past the surface, to the soul beneath. God's mercy had led her through darkness to this moment, this man, this future once mocked but now shining with promise. The cabin beckoned them home, its windows glowing like heaven's own lanterns. As they walked hand in hand toward its warmth, Samantha felt complete. She was loved. She was chosen. She was exactly who she was meant to be. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.